Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Support a Sustainable and Resilient Collaboration. I am Jennifer Splansky-Juster with the Collective Impact Forum, and I am so thrilled to be here with colleagues from the Tamarack Institute and the United Way of Salt Lake today. Thank you all for joining us. During today's webinar, we will be going for 60 minutes. And in addition to having wonderful presentations from our colleagues, we want to hear from you. And there are two ways to do that here in our Zoom webinar. If you want to connect with others on the line and express your thoughts, please use the chat. I can already see the chat is active. And if you want to ask a question of our wonderful guests and panelists, please do use the Q&A box. So those are two separate options, that you have a Q&A option and a chat. And with a group this size, it will just really help us if you can put all of your questions into the Q&A box. We are recording today's session, and it will be made available to you later this week. And also, we have the slides available for you, and we can send those out to you to make those available should you wish to look at them at a later time. Just a couple more tech tips. We have the option for live captions turned on, and that is something that you are able to toggle on and off in your Zoom toolbar. Finally, if you have any other questions, please feel free to either message or email Tracy, our colleague who is running today's webinar. And I also want to give a special thank you and shout out to Tracy for making today possible. Thank you so much. Before we go further, I want to spend a moment to acknowledge the land that this session is being hosted and recorded on. Today's session is being hosted and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone, Coast Salish, Muckleshoot, Stillaquamish, Suquamish, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land itself and the people of these tribes. We also would like to invite you all to let us know where you are joining from today. So please do use the chat to do that. And if that is something that you'd like to look up, there are two great resources that we're sharing here, native-land.ca and land from codeforanchorage.org. These are both great sites to look up which lands you are joining from today, if that's new information for you. So please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we welcome you and all of the want to recognize the lands of all of the folks who are joining today. In addition, of course, land acknowledgements are just a very, very small first step to making connections and honoring the Indigenous people in the land that we are on. And I'd like to just mention some wonderful resources from the Native Governance Center, that talk about steps for going beyond the land acknowledgement. And they have a guide there, and really encourage everybody, as you're building relationships with folks in your community as part of your collective impact and collaborative work, reaching out to Indigenous folks locally and understanding the perspectives and experiences of local Indigenous communities, we really hope can be part of your collective impact work if it is not already the case. So please check out Native Governance Center for additional resources for moving beyond the land acknowledgement. So with that, I am delighted to welcome our guests for today. So bear with me one moment here. So today's session is going to be largely based on a terrific new guide that has been created and published by our colleagues at the Tamarack Institute. When the folks at Tamarack mentioned that they were going to be doing this deep dive and creating a resource on sustainable and resilient collaboration, I knew that this was going to be a fabulous resource and a very in-demand resource. So thank you so much to Tamarack for doing such a great job creating the guide that you're just going to begin to share with us today. And two of the authors of the guide are joining us today. So first we have, and I'm just going to take down the slides so you all can give a wave and say hello as I introduce you. First, we have Liz Weaver, co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she leads the Tamarack Learning Center, which is focused on advancing community change leadership. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. Next from Tamarack, another co-author, we have Mike Desjardins, the Manager of Sustainability and Development for Communities Building Youth Futures. In this role, Mike is responsible for sustainability planning, researching, and sharing best practices related to the sustainability and resilience of youth collective impact work, coaching CBYF communities on developing and implementing sustainability strategies, and telling the story of impact. Finally, joining us from United Way of Salt Lake is Amy Ahrens Terpstra, the Chief Impact Officer. She leads the talented team working to cultivate partnerships capable of creating lasting social change in schools, neighborhoods, and across the region. And Amy, thank you for joining to share about the work of United Salt Lake to help bring these ideas to life. I encourage you to read more about all of our wonderful guests online. They all have very interesting backgrounds that are contributing to the work. But for today, we'll keep them short, and I'm going to hand it over to Mike to get us started.
Great, thanks, Jen. So hi, everyone. Excited to have you with us for this conversation today. So as a bit of a background, Tamarack has spent the last 20 years supporting place-based work in over 400 communities across Canada and around the world. We've learned a lot during that time about what collaborations can do to be sustainable and resilient and what challenges them. Next slide. So we decided to develop a 10 guide to unpack the concepts of sustainability and resilience and break down the information into edible chunks, which include 10 assessment questions, 10 factors of sustainability, 10 practices for resilience, 10 inspiring stories, 10 resources, 10 ideas for funders, which is unique to this guide, and 10 ideas for going deeper. So to develop the guide, we engaged an advisory that included representatives of collaborations, funders, community-based practitioners, and thought leaders to share their wisdom with us. We connected with collaborations across Canada to share their stories of sustainability and resilience. And we researched what others have been contributing to the conversation about these two very important topics. Shout out to Jen Splansky-Juster, who gave her time and shared her wisdom and experience with us on our advisory committee. So thank you, Jen, for that. The 10 guide was developed as, next slide. The 10 guide was developed as part of Communities Building Youth Futures initiative of Tamarack to support those communities in determining how to build sustainable collaborations. But we made it open and accessible to all collaborations. Just as a background, CBYF is funded by the Government of Canada. It's a 5-year pan-Canadian project to develop collective impact and system-wide solutions for and with youth as they build and act upon their plans for the future. So to get us started, maybe Amy, as a practitioner, and maybe you can ground the conversation and tell us a little bit about the collective impact framework and describe how it plays out in your work.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Jen, Liz, Mike, for inviting me here, and for all of you for showing up. You know, I was thinking about this a little bit and realizing that, you know, the couple hundred of you that are here on the call, you're like in the know about collective impact, I assume, right? And if we were in person, I feel like I would make us all chant together like the, you know, original 5 conditions of collective impact, and we'd shout out common agenda, shared measurement. And then we transition to like the, you know, how do we center equity? And we, you know, talk about shifting power and all of those things that we know and that we can find as amazing resources for our collective impact partnerships. So the way today that I really wanted to describe how we think about collective impact in our community in Utah and in Salt Lake City is this. We think that our collective impact partnership exists to solve what we call the results paradox. And this is the paradox. This is the result paradox. It kind of goes like this. We've all written this, and or we've all been on the receiving end of reading something that says this. Often it shows up in a grant application. So it says something like this. Our program does the world's best work. We help people, and here's how we help them. Here's how many of them we help. Our program is amazing. You should fund us. Then the next paragraph says, and the conditions in our community are terrible. Nothing's getting better. Poverty's high, health outcomes are poor, everything's bad, please fund us. How can those two things be true constantly and consistently across time and across communities? How can every program say that they do amazing work and they're getting outcomes? And how can that work not be adding up to changing conditions at scale in our community? So we had that realization 20 years ago, and we began to refashion ourselves from what had been a traditional United Way into a backbone organization for our region's Cradle to Career Collective Impact Initiative, and we call that the Promise Partnership. And as that backbone organization, we are building this partnership. We have been for decades. We're doing it more going into our future, building it to really address those root causes of inequity in order to achieve population level change. So, like, to really get succinct about it, we talk about collective impact as trying to get many organizations to act like one organization. That means fully integrating your planning, your funding, and all of your activities in pursuit of a shared goal. So on the next slide, you'll see how that really sort of looks for us at its highest level. So we have sort of 3 tiers, if you will, of collective impact work that we weave together. So on the left, you'll see that we run Utah 211, which is an information and referral center connecting people to basic needs resources. We also support community schools. We weave together strong school leadership culture, basic needs supports, authentic family engagement, aligned out of school supports, and we backbone bringing those together to improve outcomes for kids in schools. Then we move over into the middle. We have Promise communities. We have 9 of them around our region. These are collections of community schools, civic leaders who are really working together to create very robust systems of supports for kids and families. And then there on the right, you see that we also do this systems change work. We're identifying levers of policy, practice, power, resource changes that can impact many children, many families all at once. So when I think about collective impact, I think about this very tiered and interrelated structure that we've developed, infrastructure that we've developed to achieve more equitable outcomes for kids.
Great. So now, talking about acting as one and that moving towards that shared goal, maybe we can go a little bit deeper into what sustainability means. So, Liz, did you want to share what sustainability means to you?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And it's so good to hear, Amy, the example from Salt Lake, because I think sometimes we talk about these things in more abstract than in concrete terms, and understanding it from a concrete perspective is really helpful. Mike mentioned that we've been doing the work at Tamarack around communities building youth futures, but we've also been working at ending poverty in Canada. We've been working at helping communities to navigate climate transitions and also addressing social isolation and loneliness through the building of resilient neighborhoods. And so for me, having been at Tamarack for about 15 years, as I look across all the things that we're doing at Tamarack, I have been thinking about and in conversation with lots of community leaders around, what does sustainability really mean to you? And what are the things that are important to you? And as we look at initiatives that have sustained their work over 20 years, we actually kind of begin to see a number of factors rise up to the top in terms of sustainability. And it's not just about money, but money is important, right? So having enough human and financial resources to be able to do the work is critical. And I think that was really raised through the collective impact approach, where they talked about, do we have adequate human and financial resources as one of those preconditions of collective impact. But then we started to broaden it and really start to look at things that are related to the financial resources. We're going to get into the factors in a minute or so, but it really does mean, do we have the right kind of resources in place to be able to sustain this effort to get at these really complex issues in a deep and durable way that leads to impact. And I think, you know, you didn't ask about resilience, Mike, but I'll just jump in here and talk about resilience, because in the guide, we talk about both sustainability and resilience. And what we've noticed over 20 years at Tamarack is that even as you begin to intervene in a community and in a community change effort, the community starts to respond, right? They start to act differently. They start to partner differently, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, but they are reacting to you in real time. And so resilience is about being really attentive to the shifts that are happening in your community, and then really trying to figure out, okay, how can this shift be something that we can utilize to our advantage, or is it a shift that we ignore, right? And so being very proactive in that way. And I think that those are things that we've been thinking about at Tamarack around both sustainability and resilience. Amy, what have you been thinking about in Salt Lake?
Yeah, I would just echo that. You know, it's amazing to have this guide, because I feel like so many of us who have been doing this work for, you know, the decade or two that we have sort of been like intuiting our way into some of these principles, and we've had to learn them the hard way. And so having them in front of us to aim for and to build intentionally around is so important. I would just summarize, you know, we think about sustainability in terms of like, what do we need to keep going to get our outcome? And resiliency is pretty simply like, how do you build those things then that you need to keep going? And then to your really good point, how do you navigate those shifts and changes? Like, sort of think of it as like a house that's built near the shoreline, and it has some give to it. So how can it sustain the hurricane? But does it need to give a little bit, or like a skyscraper that needs to give a little bit with the wind? And so that's sort of how I think about those things here for us.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And, you know, every time I've talked to collaboratives, the biggest thing is defining what sustainability and resilience means to them. So thank you for sharing your definitions, Liz and Amy, and hopefully folks start to unpack that in the collaborations that they work with as well. So to go a little bit deeper, Liz, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the 10 factors that we outlined in the guide and touch a little bit on the resilience practices as well.
Sure. I'll start off with the sustainability factors. And while there are 10, because our guides are always written around the number 10, we actually started to factor them into 4 buckets, which might be a little bit easier for people to navigate. And we think about these as people factors, as resource factors, as process factors, and as impact factors. And we think that they are all connected and interrelated to each other. At least that's what we've heard from our conversations with the advisory team, with the National Collaborative of CBYF, and with other people that we've talked to, United Ways, Centraide Canada, and other partners. And I would not say that any of these outweighs the other. They actually all are in relationship with one another. So the people factors are, they really start with this notion of equity, and really understanding from the perspective of the problem that you're trying to solve for in your community. Who are those individuals most deeply impacted by that problem, and how do we bring equity to the way that we might move our collaboration forward? And what are the elements of equity that we want to bring into our collaboration from a problem perspective, but also from a people perspective? And we know that any complex problem needs the wisdom of many. They don't benefit from the wisdom of few. They actually need the wisdom of many, and particularly people with lived and living experience of the issue that you're trying to solve for. So people is really critical, and equity and inclusion is foundational. And then it's about how much trust and how strong the ties are between the partners. If you're working in a community, and there are communities like this where there are weaker ties or higher degrees of mistrust or lack of trust, it's good. You can get there, but it's going to take you a bit longer, right? So you really want to focus on the ties between the partners, and you also want to have both an inwardly facing yes, this is the work of the Salt Lake Collaborative and the Promise Partnerships, but you also want to be outwardly facing, right? You want to engage as many people and create the opportunities for as many partners in the community to be engaged and to do some of that shared lifting. And sometimes collective impact efforts only are inwardly facing, and they are to their detriment. And so what we suggest is, in a sustainability way, both being inwardly and outwardly facing at the same time really creates those conditions of sustainability, because the community begins to believe, hey, yeah, we can tackle this issue. It's complex, but we see that there's energy here and that, we're going to be able to move forward. The resource factors are, they tie into the people factors, of course, but they also expand them. So it's about adequate human and financial resources, right? And having the right mix of resources. This is the long game, not the short game. And so what do we need? What is that mix of the right people around the table, the right kind of ideas, the right kind of perspectives, but also the right financial resources required? And then inviting your partners to contribute to the work in meaningful ways. And this shows up really differently for lots of collaborations. In some cases, it might be that you take a piece of the work and you say, hey, partner, are you willing to lead out on this work? And we'll, share some of the resources with you to help you lead out on the work, or you can contribute your knowledge and your expertise to this table in a meaningful way. And, some of the things that I've learned in supporting lots of collaboration is that we don't often make that purposeful ask, and yet we have to in order to make these collaborations or to encourage sustainability over the longer term. The process factors are the compelling case, the common agenda work that you talked about, Amy, that is so important, and that everybody on the call I know reflects about, right? So it's not only a common agenda, but is it compelling? Right? Does it actually get people to stop and go, oh, I see this as aspirational and I see it as a challenge and I'm up for the challenge, right? So there are things around that compelling case that are really critical. And then also spending time in real time reflecting and learning about what is shifting in your community. And that one ties directly into the resilience factors, right? So are we reflecting? Are we learning? Are we sense making together? Are we understanding what progress is helping us speed up progress, or what's slowing us down? And so that's a really important process factor. And then the final three factors are really about impact, right? And impact is everything from using data and evidence to show your impact and identify your approach, sharing that as widely as you can to build a beating drum of connection and support, and then really using that to really influence policies and systems change. And I think that that's what we've seen at Tamarack, is the more we can influence policy and systems change, the deeper and more durable and more sustainable are the results of this work across communities and across different levels. So that's the 10 factors in 4 buckets. Do you want me to go on and talk about the resilience practices, Mike?
You just want to touch just briefly on them. That would be great.
Okay. So again, they tie really nicely into the factors, and you can see them here. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm going to pick 2 that I think are really important. One is the leveraging of existing assets. And this is a dilemma I see communities and collaborations fall into, a trap they fall into over and over again, that they want to get recognition for this common agenda work. And by doing so, they start to build things that they don't necessarily need to build because they already exist in the community. And so really looking across your community, mapping what's already going on, and then inviting that in to be leveraged in a way that kind of moves the boats in one direction, I think is a really important one. And then the second one I'm going to pick on, just because I think, we wait for the perfect plan. right? And we're dealing with complex issues that people haven't been able to solve over a long period of time. So we're never going to get to perfect. And perfect is the enemy of good enough. And so let's get to a good enough plan and then experiment and prototype. And those are resiliency practices, right? So don't worry that you don't get it perfect, because the community is changing. And so getting to good enough enables you to get momentum. And I would imagine that those of you who have joined us on the call today, you've all gotten to good enough, or you're somewhere in your journey to good enough, and you've probably thought to yourself, oh my goodness, I got to get out of this perpetual planning mode. Good enough is the way to escape that perpetual planning mode. So those are two I would want to highlight in resilience practices. There are more in the guide, and you can read them at your leisure.
Great, thanks, Liz. Yeah, so now that we've kind of unpacked the two concepts, let's get into a little bit more of the stories, because stories bring theory to life. And we think they're important in sharing how sustainability and resilience plays out on the ground. So I certainly invite you to read all of the stories in our guide, but I'll touch on a couple of examples from the 10 from the guide. So one is Food First NL. It's a collaboration working with communities in Newfoundland and Labrador to ensure everyone has access to affordable, healthy, and culturally appropriate food since 1998. So the way that they've defined sustainability and approached it is around building capacity across all levels. So individuals, local communities, and systems by scaling out, scaling up, and scaling deep to create sustainability. They scale up through advocacy work in shifting systems that impact food security, which in turn impacts laws and policy. They scale deep through partnership development. That's the relationship piece we've been talking about, and supporting innovation through social enterprise, which then impacts cultural roots. They scale out to build sustainability and capacity and grow the food security movement in local communities across the province. Another example, I love talking about this one because it's kind of different from what we would normally think about sustainability, but Calgary Reads. It's a collaboration that grew over 20 years to support the community's need to improve early literacy with the goal that all children in Calgary, Alberta, and across the province would become joyful and confident readers. So they looked at sustainability differently, and they've taken risks to refocus their collaborative efforts by basically strategically imploding their structure. So they had a structure that was working well in terms of providing programming to the community, but it had become limiting and despite in allowing them to continue towards their movement. And so they embraced adaptability and flexibility, and they recognized that sustainability isn't always about maintaining the status quo or scaling existing collaborative work. And so they decided to return to their core values of collaboration and take a new path and structure that better aligns with their movement forward. So some things that we heard across all the collaborations that we spoke with, a number of these, both Amy and Liz have kind of touched on. Equity is at the center of successfully sustained collaborations, who the collaboration effort supports, and who it involves and how, so authentically and with shared power. That collective impact conditions lend themselves to greater sustainability and resilience. The conditions just naturally reinforce sustainability. They capitalize on opportunities to strengthen their collaboration and break down silos to work collectively on a shared agenda. They're values-driven and purpose-focused. They always think ahead to the next steps of their collaborative effort, doing that ongoing planning so that they're ready and building the infrastructure to support their future needs. They see sustainability from an optimistic and an abundance mindset rather than scarcity and competition. They seek out and secure diverse funding that is longer term and flexible, and are building relationships with funders to establish trust. They recognize that not everything needs to be sustained. They know when something has run its course or where pieces of the work can be taken over by others in the community. They value and cultivate partnerships and strong community involvement and investment. And they recognize that they're not perfect at planning for sustainability, and that there are areas, the factors and the elements that need to have effort put into them to be supported. Things like succession planning for staffing and leadership. So that's what we heard from the stories that we collected, but we think it's important to look into the US context, and that's why we have Amy with us to bring sustainability to life in this conversation. So Amy, can you tell us a little bit more about the Promise Partnership of Utah?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Liz and Mike, as you all were going through some of those, my brain's just firing about all of these examples of ways that I know that we have made sustainability type decisions about our work. And so we've had those stop decisions, like you see here. We ran a chronic absence network that I probably held on to for way too long because I didn't feel like I had like the permission, in this context, like we have to keep this going. We have to backbone this. We've made these decisions around transitioning things, asking those partners to step up, like you were talking about, Liz, and make that important contribution to continuing something so the backbone organization didn't have to. And then we have a decision like the one that we're currently engaged in still for academic outcomes in our preschool context. So I have lots of those types of examples, certainly, but where my brain really went when I was thinking about this question was sort of zooming out a little bit and talking a bit more about how we've calibrated our very infrastructure with sustainability and resiliency practices in mind. And I have to say that, my main lesson learned, I just seem to have to keep learning it over and over again, is that sustainability has to be really intentionally built, cultivated, and very carefully attended to. Like it does not just magically happen because we sort of hope that it does. And so we've really pushed ourselves to try to make sure that it is baked into our strategic planning. It is baked into the way that we are and that we exist in the world. So I'll give you 3 sort of examples about that. So on the next slide, you're going to see that this slide I showed you before with a few additions. So I have added these blue boxes at the bottom of our different pieces of work. So one way that we can think about our collective impact work is that we do work, we build collective impact partnerships that are helping to mitigate the very worst impacts of poverty on people's lives. So that's our 2-on-1 work. That's our community schools work. That's important. We need to make those systems of responses much, much, much better for people. We need to help meet them where they're at. We need to ask them to not navigate us. We need to design ourselves around them. Then we do work in Promise communities where we're building those pathways out of poverty for people. Those are the pathways that are more seamless for folks, for kids, usually cradle to career, that building the supports around their schools, making sure that those schools are amazing places where their potential is realized so that they can get to that point of graduating, go on to post some sort of awesome post-secondary opportunity, make a living wage, support their families. That's the moving out of poverty piece. But if we just did those things for us locally here in Salt Lake and in Utah, that might not be very sustainable for us. We would have done an amazing job aligning programs, aligning interventions, aligning services in a way that matters fundamentally for people's lives. But we will have created something that we have to maintain in perpetuity. Somebody has to maintain it in perpetuity. So for us, that systems work, which was the thing we came to last in this infrastructure about 10 years ago, we have to do that work to make our education and adjacent systems more responsive to BIPOC and families experiencing poverty. If we're not doing the work to help our systems actually absorb what we know works in our community schools and in our Promise communities to make the system produce the more equitable outcomes on its own, then we haven't done sort of the ultimate sustainability work in this collective impact environment. Then the second thing that I'll point out is more down on the bottom where I've written down resiliency core. So this isn't quite labeled like this on the slide, but I really think about our backbone staffing as being sort of the holder of the resiliency practices in many respects. All of this work, as you all know so well, it hinges on relationships and it hinges on momentum. So getting stuck in that spiral that you were talking about, Liz, of just like admiring the problem and feeling like we don't have the perfect plan, right? That's about momentum to me. And so I think we've really tried to incorporate resiliency practices into how we structure our backbone staffing, not just in our own backbone organization, but by extension, some of the other community-based organizations that we support to be local backbone. So internally at our organization, after a lot of trial and error over the years, we now operate with a backbone staffing model that partners a more experienced backbone team member with a less experienced one. And they do all of their work together. So they have the same portfolio. And that really allows us to make sure that the continuity of relationships and work is really there. If somebody leaves, there's somebody else there to continue it. The relationships don't kind of go away with one person leaving. The work can kind of continue instead of having a 3 to 5 month gap in the work because we don't have a staff person to run it. So it has just been pretty transformational for us to have that kind of paired model. And then this isn't even an unintended consequence. This is like a forefronted intention on our part. It also allows us to better build the pipeline of talent in our backbone team that reflects the communities that we work with. And that's very intentional. That's one of those core kind of equity practices and resiliency practices that we really are very serious about. So we train up those backbone pairs in what I like to think of as like predictable but flexible backbone practices. So we equip them with all the tools of our collective impact trade, root cause analyses, results-based accountability, all of those things that many of you are well versed in. And we train them up to be fantastic adaptive leaders to know sort of when to use which of those so that they're just really meeting their partnerships and their community really where they're at. I'll also note that we have invested very heavily in our data infrastructure. So that was one of those key sort of sustainability elements. We have just really realized that there's no one else in our ecosystem that's positioned to do this in a way that goes across organizational boundaries other than us as the backbone organization for the Promise Partnership. So we've invested very heavily in our talent on the backbone team and in our systems to make sure that that piece of the partnership is always there and that we're using the data, both quantitative and qualitative, about people's lived experience, all on that mix, making sure that that's there. And then the last thing I'll mention on this front is that one thing that I don't think we have done very well as a sustainability approach and a resiliency practice that we are now doubling down on is we are really fostering that shared partnership identity. And as an element of that, leaning into the element of constant communication. So we have to more greatly center the Promise Partnership as everybody's thing, as we're all Promise partners. And there's a backbone organization that helps pursue that, but we're all in this together, sort of that one organization vibe that I was talking about before. And then the last thing that I'll mention on this front is it has been absolutely instrumental to us to lean into frameworks and assessments. So this guide is newer, but we are part of the Strive Together network of Cradle to Career Collective Impact Partnerships. And Strive Together has developed something that they call the theory of action. And in it, they have identified the hallmarks of a sustainable partnership mapped onto a continuum from emerging to transformational. And we are assessed against that theory of action regularly. So and it's pretty rigorous. Like we have to submit evidence that we've met these different benchmarks. They conduct focus groups with our partners. And in the end, we're given very objective third-party feedback on if we're meeting those different standards. So that discipline has been very important for us because it pushes us to reflect on our own practices. It pushes us to create really intentional plans for how to become a more sustainable partnership. And it has just, in the same way that this guide has, it has just brought the idea of what these, and it's operationalized, I guess, the different components of these things that we all talk about, but nobody ever gets to the point of identifying and saying, here's how you do it. So just a plug for this guide. I think it's really important for our field of collective impact partnerships to approach this with the level of rigor and discipline that we approach so much else in our work with.
Thanks, Amy. What a fantastic example. And what really stood out to me was investing in things very intentionally and building capacity of people and of structures to make those systems changes. So you talked about the Strive Together example as a tool. Liz, I'm looking to you now, what tools does Tamarack Institute offer that might be helpful for collaborations as they look more closely at sustainability?
Yeah, so we're developing a whole suite of tools, but the first one that we have put out is a sustainability self-assessment tool. And Mike, you mentioned earlier on, or maybe it was you, Amy, the first question that you want to start with is, what is our shared definition of sustainability? And then what is it that we hope to sustain? Because not everything needs to be sustained, things evolve over time. And so this self-assessment tool takes you through shared thinking around those kind of foundational questions, and then brings in the sustainability factors, and you can assess how your collaboration is doing relative to those 10 factors, and you build a work plan coming out of those 10 factors. So it's a pretty comprehensive tool. We also are going to be releasing in the next couple of weeks a planning canvas for your collaboration partners, and we will be looking at the resilience factors in more detail. So more to come, but this is our start at a sustainability self-assessment tool. And we, with both this tool and with the guide, we are very much of the opinion that they are works in progress. So we might not have gotten it completely right, and we would love to have your feedback. So if you encounter something as you're reading through the guide, or if you encounter something in the tool, please let us know, and we will continue to evolve both products. And something that we're really looking forward to, eh, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to any feedback that folks have to offer us. So Jen, over to you now for question and answer.
Hello, everyone. And Liz, Amy, Mike, thank you so much for taking us through both the guide and the framework, and Amy sharing the story from your amazing work in Salt Lake. We have lots of questions, not a surprise. So I'm going to take us through as many as possible that we can get through. There are a couple that I'd like to start with that are asking for some recommendations on building trust and strong ties across community partners. That comes up in the guide as a key factor. And I'm sort of looking at you, Liz, because I know you have done a lot of research and thinking on building trust, but others, please feel free to add as well.
Yeah, trust is a whole workshop that we do at Tamarack, and we're going to be delivering it again in July and August. So watch our website for opportunities. But trust is so important in collaborative work, because if we don't have good levels of trust in our community, it takes us a bit longer to get to the point where we're really quite effective as a community. And it's interesting, right? Because it also means who convenes the collaborative has an impact on whether people feel like it's a trusted collaborative or not. And sometimes, in the work that Mike and I are most familiar with in Hamilton around the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. In the early days, that roundtable was convened by the Community Foundation and the municipal government. And while both organizations had a great degree of trust, and people thought, oh yeah, these are great groups to convene the Poverty Roundtable, there's a power imbalance with both of those organizations and other partners in the community. And so we had to work our way through that. And I think, the best way that you can work your way through this, and I'm sure, Amy, you would have something to add from your experience in Salt Lake as well, is to be as open and transparent as you can be, and to work early on around values and principles for working together. And this is particularly important when you bring some folks who maybe aren't as comfortable in collaborative processes, people with lived and living experience of poverty. We found that we had to slow down, that we had to be very intentional, that we had to listen carefully, that we had to create opportunities for different types of conversations to emerge. And I think that all of that went far towards building trust in our communities. So Amy, I'll invite you to maybe, I know we have lots of questions, but maybe a quick answer from your perspective.
I just plus on all of that, Liz, and offer one of the pitfalls that I notice sometimes that we get into on our team is we view our backbone role in the partnership, and we have sort of these, we're like this spoke, we're the hub, and different partners are the spoke. And we don't intentionally foster those multilateral relationships of partners with each other. We sort of view ourselves as the connective tissue. And so you really have to guard against that. And you have to create those spaces where the partners do come together, have those honest conversations that Liz is talking about, because you can easily fall into the trap of trying to broker it behind the scenes. You have a trusting relationship with all the partners, but you forget to create the right conditions for them to all trust each other.
And can I just add from more of a funder perspective, if we've got any funders on the call, building trust-based philanthropy, where you're going along with the journey with the backbone organization, so that you understand what is happening and building relationships as you go. That would be my input.
Thank you all. Those are super helpful tips and examples. Another question that someone asks is if you could speak about the role of elected officials in collective impact and sustainability of the work, and perhaps even, the public sector more broadly.
Yeah, I can offer a beginning to that. So when I talk about that systems work and how I feel that in our community, we're not truly sustainable unless we are completely redesigning those systems. It feels, and it is for us, instrumental to have our legislators and our different public officials in a variety of different contexts, local, county, state. We don't do as much federal, but they hold those levers. And so involving them at the right level is really important for us. So we've had, again, lots of trial and error there. We have made decisions at some point to involve those types of decision makers in the sausage making of the partnership. And sometimes that has worked, most often it hasn't. And so we have sort of settled into a structure where a lot of those decision makers are at a table, but it might not be the table where the real like nitty gritty work through it type of partnership work is going on, but we're cultivating those relationships, not just us as the backbone organization, but strategic partners within it are cultivating the relationships so that we have the folks to call when we say, hey, we have this idea of something that needs to change. Other times it's just dependent. Maybe we do have a legislator who wants to be sort of at the nitty gritty table, and that's okay. So it's just a matter of knowing those relationships really well and having that trust with those folks, understanding how they best operate and how they can best plug in. That's what's been, I think, most conducive for us. And we have some great examples around that, around our early childhood work in particular, where we've found the right place to plug people in, found that trust, and then figured out how to leverage it when the time came.
I think with elected officials and with public sector individuals, you have to really pay attention to continuous communications with them. Sometimes we don't put them on our radar screen, but we really need to, particularly if we want to get to deep and durable change. They are a particular group of partners that you really have to pay attention to. And my colleague Mark Cabage talks about this way of communicating who needs what packaged how for what purpose. And so when you're thinking about elected officials and staff within government, you want to think about, what do they need? How do you want to package it? And then what ultimately do you hope they will do with it? Will it change legislation? Will it create awareness? Will it bring you some funding? What is it that you want? If you're going to be purposefully communicating, what is the intent of that communication and what do you hope they will do with it?
That's great. A couple questions coming in here are curious to know more about data and evidence, because you talked about the impact factors related to data and evidence and tracking and reporting progress. So I think, Amy, folks would love to hear a little bit about the data systems and how you all use data in your work. And then perhaps Liz or Mike, if you want to share some general observations. And I want to also recognize, and we had a question about the backbone teams. Salt Lake is a pretty well-resourced backbone team. And when we know a lot of folks may not have the same size of resources. So if you could give a little bit of flavor to what that might look like in an organization that might not have quite as many resources, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll start on the first half of that. So what our data infrastructure looks like, it's multifaceted. First, we have a number of data sharing agreements with the data producers and holders in our community. So with local school districts, with our state office of education, that gives us access to the population level data that we need to understand conditions in our community and to set targets and to hold that population accountability that's so important as a backbone organization and for our partnership. We then play sort of a data intermediary role with our different partners. And so to the degree that they need those data, especially if they need them linked to their program participants to understand their impact on academic outcomes, we do that linkage and we turn that data back around to them. So we hold a data integration and continuous improvement role with our partners as well. We build shared data systems. One of those was one that we sort of then transitioned to a partner to run. Now we're back in the space of saying, what could it look like to develop a community specific community information exchange around data. So I would characterize this element of our work as we're sort of the, in many respects, the conversation catalyzer around how we use data in social change movements, really. And then we have a whole, and our backbone team, an entire team dedicated to grassroots engagement and to community-based research. And so we are bringing in the voices and the participation and the co-ownership and co-design of people and youth in our community and people who are experiencing the injustices of our current system. And so we're really trying to bring together both of those things, the sort of traditional way that we've thought and used data and the way that we can acknowledge the important experience of people in our community to create that 360 view.
And maybe just a quick follow-up I saw come in. Does your data, someone was curious if it interacts at all with Candid or GuideStar, or is it anything coming or interacting with Candid or GuideStar?
No, I think I can be succinct and just say no. I might not be fully understanding that question, but the data that we have is mostly, we're using it, we're putting it out there in dashboards for our community, and then we're using it in very practical ways within the partnership.
And Liz or Mike, would you like to add anything?
I think that's a really gold star kind of approach. Lots of the communities that we work with are not so gold stars. So the advice that we give them is to do what Amy said, find out who's collecting data in your community around the issue that is important to you and convene them together and find out what data is already being collected and how that data can inform the problem that you're trying to solve. And it's probably quite likely that there are a number of data collectors in the community already and lots of data being collected. And the degree to which people are willing to share that is going to be your success point, or it'll also reveal if there isn't anyone who wants to share, it'll reveal a big gap that you can talk to funders about and potentially find out that way. The other tool that we like a lot and we use very often, and I'm sure Amy, you do as well, is the Urban Institute Data Walk process, which is really community sense making around some key data points. And really, it can be a highly interactive, highly engaging opportunity for, and not that hard to navigate. I was doing some work in Elkhart County, Indiana, and around kindergarten readiness, and they used the data walk as a way of both building understanding in their broader community about the 0 to 5 years, but also building engagement around it. So there are some not simple tools, but there are some tools out there that can help you navigate data and to really navigate it in a way that's engaging and accessible.
Thank you all. So I'm going to ask this as the last question before we wrap up, and come together for closing remarks. So could you share some examples of how you have engaged or embraced spiritual, soulful, heart-centered work into these frameworks? And I just think that's such a great final question, because truly that is such a contribution to especially the resilience components of this work.
I could start. So when I was at the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, we had a table of 40 people, which is huge, but there were 10 business, 10 government, 10 nonprofits, and 10 people with the lived experience of poverty around that table. And when I was the director at that time, way before when I joined Tamarack, I went and asked every one of the roundtable members 3 questions. What is the impact on you by being a member of this roundtable? What's the impact on your organization? And what do you think the impact is on the community? And this was in probably year 2.5 of the roundtable, so fairly early on in the roundtable work. And it was so heart-bringing forward. There's some really cool stories I can tell you about from that, but I won't, because I know we don't have enough time. But I think that that's really important. And then the second thing that we use a lot at Tamarack when we're facilitating early stage collective impact work is this question: why is it important that you're here today? It's such a powerful question, because it's not that you showed up, it's actually, how is your heart connected to this work? So why is it important that you're here today?
I love those. I might steal some of those from you, Liz. We have some similar practices, and, at the end of the day, I think the stuff we were talking about before around trust building, there's a connection between this question and what the question asker is sort of pursuing here, and this notion of trust building. Like, I think we all trust each other when we trust each other's motivations, and when we trust that we know what's in each other's hearts, and that we find that common core of what we're all in it together for, and who we're in it together for. So it feels absolutely foundational. I would, as a self-critique, I think we probably, I personally, and maybe as a field, we haven't spent enough time really grappling with that question and putting our own practices up against it in a really intentional way. Collective impact meetings can often feel pretty task oriented and pretty prescriptive, like we have this plan, we need to check in about it. And so we've been really trying to be intentional about taking those big pause moments, having more sort of retreat style meetings where we can have adequate time to be together and to explore some of those deeper questions before we really, are integrated with the work, the checking the boxes sort of work that we're best known for. So that's a fabulous question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just go really quickly and say, this work is all about people. So we have to focus on the people. If you are looking at sustainability, the processes, resources, and impact will happen when you have the right people around the table, the people that are passionate and want to see change.
Thank you all. And I think that is probably going to be the last question that we can take today. So I want to wholeheartedly thank you, Mike, Liz, and Amy, for not only joining us today, but for all of the thought and care that went into creating this guide as a public document for the field. So thank you again, and I encourage everyone to check it out. And in closing, we would love to just make sure that folks know about some further opportunities to learn with the Collective Impact Forum. We have the Collective Impact Action Summit coming up in just under a month, and we hope to engage in many more conversations of this nature when we're together then. We actually will be having Mike and Liz join us for going deeper on this topic as well. And then we also have another upcoming learning opportunity with 2 of our other colleagues, Paul Schmitz and Dominique Samari, who will be talking about their work and a new toolkit about exploring how to put racial equity at the center of your collective impact work. So please do join us for one or both of these upcoming learning opportunities as well. So with that, I want to just thank you and wish everyone well on this spring day. Thanks again.